We're going to go broader now. The next question is from Larry Vincent.
After World War II, the world came together and organised the placement of millions of refugees in new countries. They were transported by ship and plane, not left to find their own way by paying people smugglers to give them a place on a rickety boat. What is stopping the world organising the placement of refugees again in this organised way? More specifically in our region, isn't the answer to the refugee influx that Australia work in conjunction with the UNHCR to process refugees in Indonesia?
OK, we'll start with Frank Brennan.
A great question, and I think you're right. What's different is we're now a very globalised world, and as Jane has said, I think 60 million displaced people in the globe, and the question is how to affect good outcomes with those flows. Now, if I might go back to Hugh's story, when Hugh's family came here, there were about 2,000 Vietnamese who arrived directly in Australia by boat. Where Australia was generous was not in receiving people who arrived by boat, but rather, like with your family, went to the embassy in Jakarta or whatever. There was a bipartisan approach by the Australian politicians to say that what we need is a regional response. We don't need to deal with this at our coastline. It's better for everyone, particularly the dignity of those in flight, that we build on a regional response and we show that we are generous. And you are absolutely right. What we've got to do, we need a transparent bipartisan arrangement with Indonesia. We also need one with Malaysia. That then becomes the building blocks for a regional agreement where we have UNHCR and IOM at the table, and then we can have arrangements in place where there is no need for people to risk getting on boats, and there can be a proper, secure dealing with people as they make their way towards Australia.
Jane.
I agree. I think the long-term goal is absolutely to be building protection capacity wherever we can, and certainly within our region, that's where Australia could have a very positive contribution. But I think we've lost a lot of credibility in recent years, and to be trying to advocate for other countries to build their own ability to assist people and to protect them requires a far more humble approach on Australia's part, a willingness to engage and to listen to the issues that concern those countries, and to take a holistic approach, recognising that building regional protection is certainly very, very important, but that's going to take time, and we don't sit back and wait for that to happen and do nothing in the meantime. So it's about modelling good practices, it's about engaging in an open, genuine way, and it's also about, once again, looking to the broader international context.
Can I just interrupt you just for one moment, because Khalid Koza, who wasn't able to join us tonight, makes the case that the 1951 Refugee Convention needs to be completely overhauled, and he thinks Australia should take a key role in making that happen, or pushing for that debate on a global front. Is the Refugee Convention part of the problem?
I think the Refugee Convention has a lot of, is often seen as responsible for a whole lot of things that it was never actually designed to do. So the Refugee Convention was never meant to be a document that would somehow manage international migration flows. It wasn't meant to be a population management tool. It was devised in the aftermath of the worst displacement the world had ever witnessed by people themselves. They were members of or representatives of governments, but many of them themselves had been displaced as refugees during the war. And they understood a thing or two about what refugees need to be able to build a dignified future within a new home. So the Refugee Convention has been a very flexible and dynamic instrument over time. The biggest deficit it has was recognised from the start. The then UN Secretary-General said it really needs to have a responsibility sharing mechanism in it, an allocation mechanism. And states weren't prepared to accept it.
Yes, one of the problems here, and I'll come to the rest of the panel on this, but just to finish Khalid Koza's point, and then we can move on. He argues that this global crisis that we're seeing, it's compounded by what he says the reality that a significant number of those seeking asylum are not found to be genuine refugees. He cites UNHCR figures in 2012, 700,000 people applied for asylum, only 30% were found to be refugees.
Well, it depends where you're talking about. I mean, in Australia and in PNG and Nauru, the figures are up around 90% and have been consistently for a very long time. And I think that's one of the great tragedies of the system we have, is that we're not turning away people who are simply setting out in search of a better life. We are turning away people to whom we not only have legal responsibilities, but people who need protection. They are people that have, as I said, not set out on a world tour, but have set out because they are desperately trying to find a place where they can live a dignified existence.
All right, I'm going to go across to Jim. The Khalid Koza thing on the Refugee Convention, is that you think that it needs to be reformed, and is that part of the argument or discussion we should be having?
I haven't dealt with it for a couple of years. When I was dealing with it, I accepted it for what it was and found ways to do what we were doing. That is, each and every year to bring successfully 13,750 people to Australia under the humanitarian program. And that is the safe, lawful pathway that we should be concentrating on. Now, at the time, 70% of the people supported us. They weren't concerned about the Refugee Convention. Larry made a point about, I think it was Larry, apologies if it was Larry. Larry made a point about setting up processing in Indonesia and back into Malaysia. Frank said, Larry, you're totally right. I think, Larry, you're totally wrong. The consequences of doing that and the practicalities of doing that are absolutely appalling, for the simple reason that we are guaranteeing people to get to Indonesia. If you get to Indonesia, we'll look after you, put you on a bus and a train and a plane, get you to Australia quite safely. The consequences would be that the vast majority of 20 million refugees will come our way.
So,
now,
can I just go, Jim, can I just confirm...
The point is that Australians will not accept that.
Okay, Jim, does that mean that a regional solution is not on the cards?
We've got a regional solution. It just happens to be a region that some people on this panel, I suspect,
but most people identify a regional solution as being a big regional processing centre.
And this comes back to our Vietnamese experience. The Vietnamese experience is critical to how Operation Sovereign Borders work. Frank was quite right. Of the 60,000 Vietnamese that were accepted by Australia as refugees, 2,100 only came by boat. 3% came by boat. The reason that they all didn't come by boat was that they were slaughtered in the seas off Vietnam by pirates, by faulty boats, by people smugglers and by storms. And the region got so sick of this, UNHCR agreed with Vietnam to put people into the big camps. Galung was probably one of them. And from there, we had an orderly processing system which brought the other 97% of our good Vietnamese down into Australia. That's exactly what Operation Sovereign Borders is designed to achieve, an orderly process.
All right, let's hear it, Shen.
I mean, that's just completely incorrect. What the Vietnamese experience shows us is that the way you react to people dying at sea is by setting up a situation so they don't have to get on a boat. You don't react to it by pushing boats back into seas and putting children and families inside detention camps.
A previous government tried that and they failed.
No, well, can I bring a point to you, Jim? So right now, we have Ali. Ali is a Syrian citizen. Ali has brothers in Sydney because we come from all the nations in the world in Australia and many of us have family still back in home countries. Ali has Syrian family in Sydney. Citizens there for years, had kids here, part of this country. Now, he can see in Syria that war is about to start. So what does Ali do? He applies through the formal, safe pathways for family reunion to Australia. And do you know what the waiting list in our immigration program is at the moment for that family reunion? It's 30 years. So he can't get in through that way. So he tries again. He tries to do a student visa for his son. But because they are coming from a war-torn region, he is flagged by the immigration department and he can't even pay for a university place for his son. He's an engineer, so he tries to apply through skilled migration visas. Now, mind you, this is the 800,000 other people coming to this country.
I'm not too sure where this is going.
Wait, I'll tell you where it's going. So what happens is he's blocked in every other way. Yeah. So what does he do when bombs rain on his house? He gets on a boat, he puts his hands into the lives of a people smuggler and he comes here and he runs straight into Operation Sovereign Borders, and that man is now spending the last 3 years on Manus Island. Now, you tell me whether that's a policy failure or policy success.
It is a policy success, ladies and gentlemen, because 1,200 people died when we tried to do it in a separate way. 1,200 people died. The greatest human right we can give to these people is to be alive.
Okay,
is Ali alive?
Frank Brennan
Ali is alive.
Frank Brennan wants to jump in. Go ahead.
Just on your question about the Refugee Convention, could I make 3 quick points about it? One is that neither Indonesia nor Malaysia is a signatory to the Refugee Convention and never will be. So building a regional response in this part of the world, the Refugee Convention is not as significant as it might be elsewhere. Second point, Refugee Convention was drawn up in 1951 before most of the real powerful human rights instruments. So there are no review mechanisms in it. There's no regular reporting by countries. So it's weak in that regard. But the third and most significantly, the Refugee Convention does not deal with things like civil war and humanitarian disasters. And when you look at the 50, 60 million displaced people in the world today, it's not that they're necessarily refugees fleeing because they're being persecuted. Rather, they, like all their neighbours, are the victims of civil war. They're the victims of humanitarian disaster. And therefore, what the world is being called to, particularly first world countries like ourselves, is the generosity, because we have secure borders, because we've got wealth, because we've got the rule of law, to be doing our part in terms of humanitarian assistance well beyond what's there in the Refugee Convention.
I'm going to... the next question will allow everyone to respond anyway.